Apologies in advance if the audio on this one isn't ideal, but I think a special review like this necessitates a special change in scenery. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I am talking about the 1994 soundtrack album by Vangelis for the movie Blade Runner. Jesus Christ, this year has been relentless. In the span of a few months, we lost Klaus Schulze, Vangelis, Alan White of Yes, and Andy Fletcher of Depeche Mode, the latter two in the same day. So many legends passing away so close to each other that I can't even keep up. I wasn't planning on doing a tribute video for Alan White, and I don't even know if I'll even have time to do one for Depeche Mode, that fucked up as it is to admit. But Klaus Schulze's final album will be releasing this coming July, and I will be covering that. And Vangelis is obviously much too important to the history of electronic music for me to skip over, so I've obviously seen fit to review his biggest masterpiece in the Blade Runner soundtrack. Now, I have recently done a lengthy breakdown of this legendary composer and synth pioneer's studio album back catalog when I reviewed his final album, Juno to Jupiter, last year. If you want more of my thoughts on his stuff, you can check that video out. Card's gonna be up there. Though when I did that in brief segments, I also skipped over all his soundtrack albums aside from his two most famous ones in this one and Chariots of Fire. So before I start going into my thoughts on the Blade Runner soundtrack itself, I felt like for the sake of completion, I'll also give my quick thoughts on the soundtrack albums I skipped. Vangelis may be a 70s synth pioneer, but he is still most famous for his soundtrack work, and there's 8 other notable soundtracks I missed, so here's my thoughts on those. Alright, first notable omission I made is arguably his debut effort here from 1973, a soundtrack to a TV documentary by Frédéric Rossif that aired in 1970, and might have actually been a better place to start than I expected. Pretty much sets the tone of tranquil ambience that his whole career would more or less follow from there on, with a few jazzier tones here and there thrown in for good measure, since he was still part of the band Aphrodite's Child at this point. Everyone remembers this project for the second track, Les Petites Filles de la Mer, and that track is beautiful, but the whole thing is really solid from start to finish and absolutely worth listening to. Next, there's the soundtrack to the 1975 film Do You Hear the Dogs Barking, retitled as simply Ignacio in 1977. It's presented as one single 40-minute track, or split into 2 parts if you have it on vinyl. Just a meandering set of classical-inspired ambient synth pastiches. That's just as dramatic as you'd want it to be, and you can pretty clearly see how it eventually lead to what he did for Chariots of Fire. Admittedly, not as essential as the previous soundtrack, but it's nice. Another soundtrack to a nature documentary by Rossif, structured in the same way as Ignacio. And, well, this one definitely doesn't sound like any other project of his. There's a lot more focus on world music with lots of tribal drumming and African chanting, though the second half goes a lot more towards Vangelis' usual bittersweet ambient territory, which can kind of drag a bit. Still very nice as well. Also, there's some seagull noises about 2-3 minutes in that got sampled by Boards of Canada when they made Happy Cycling, so that's cool. One last nature documentary soundtrack for the same director as the other two. His second most successful project in the US behind only Chariots of Fire, and seemingly regarded as one of his absolute best works overall. It certainly is one of the most indicative looks of the sound and style that Vangelis is best known for. And while I don't know if it's so evocative for me to mark as one of my biggest personal favorites, carries over a bit of the schmaltziness of the Chariots of Fire album that I wasn't as crazy about, it is certainly a far stronger front-to-back listening experience than that project. Like an all-around improvement on the sound he explored there, except it came out 2 years earlier. I'd totally get it if you said this was your favorite album of his. Rêve and Flamante's Roses are easily the biggest highlights. The former cut wouldn't even be out of place in the album I'm actually about to review. Okay, I saw some people get particularly bothered that I didn't mention this one in my Juno to Jupiter review, another soundtrack that's widely considered to be among his best and most recognizable work, and I can confirm the hype for this one. Even better than Opera Sauvage. Really perfectly conveys that icy desolation of the setting and the dramatic story of the film in which a group of huskies are left behind on the continent and have to survive. Just as emotionally impactful as you'd want. Great stuff, if a bit on the samey side. Another one that a lot of people shout out quite frequently and mark as one of his best. I'll admit I was a little hesitant towards it, as I'm not crazy about the idea of a film celebrating the exploits of historical shithead Christopher Columbus. And by all accounts, I'm not missing much when it comes to the film itself, although the soundtrack was way better received than the movie, with the title track being one of his most successful and recognizable individual tracks he's ever made. It's his most popular track on iTunes overall right now. And alright, fair enough, this album's reputation is also pretty deserved. He worked with a full choir and various Spanish guitarists to make the sound as authentic but also as epic as it could possibly be. He kept the listening experience fairly varied, and it does really point towards the direction he'd go in later, towards synth imitation orchestral music, albeit more convincing in imitation than a lot of his regular albums afterwards tended to be. Skipping ahead from the early 90s to 2004, here we have a soundtrack he did working even more closely with a live orchestra. It's not too far away from the 1492 soundtrack. Will probably please fans of that. Though not gonna lie, the move away from more electronic textures here kind of led to this thing feeling more anonymous by comparison. And it's cool, but I can see why it's not brought up quite as often. Not to be mistaken for the Vangelis solo album, El Greco. This is his soundtrack to a totally separate film, also called El Greco. Though to be fair, I guess you could mistake it for the actual album he put out a decade prior. The vibe it created is pretty much exactly the same. Whether or not you liked that album will probably dictate how much you liked this soundtrack. It's not as long-winded thanks to being separated into 18 much shorter tracks instead of 10 really long ones. But the final effect is about as interesting, which is to say, not really huge on this either. But anyway, that brings us back to here. While I don't absolutely love every soundtrack album Vangelis ever made, and I feel like his studio albums tend to show a lot more variety and better demonstrate his constant evolution as an artist over so many decades, fact remains is that pretty much all his most iconic and easily recognizable work comes from movie soundtracks. The title theme from Chariots of Fire is his biggest, most successful hit, and the track that any person off the street is most likely to recognize. That wouldn't have been a bad subject for a tribute video, since Vangelis is pretty much the only reason people still know about that movie. But I personally feel like the actual Chariots of Fire album is kind of underwhelming as a complete whole, and said title theme hasn't entirely survived having been memed to death for several decades. So I think it makes a lot more sense to tribute him by covering the Blade Runner soundtrack. Not only is it attached to a much more iconic and timeless movie, the 1982 Ridley Scott sci-fi classic that's one of the most influential of all time in terms of its visual aesthetic, and still so frequently gets copied to this day, the soundtrack album itself is unquestionably my favorite album that Vangelis has ever put out. The highest watermark of a career that lasted over 60 years and was a game changer in its own right, in getting so many people to realize the power that synthesizers can have in the context of movie soundtracks. Now, it is worth noting that I will be focusing this review on the 1994 CD version of the soundtrack album that is most widely available at the moment, but there are a ton of different versions of the soundtrack out there, much like the actual movie itself, which saw so many re-releases and recuts, but didn't get to see a fully realized final cut version without any studio interference until 2007. Upon the movie's initial release in 1982, the only way to hear the score to this movie was an orchestral adaptation by the New American Orchestra, which both Vangelis and Ridley Scott have disowned and questioned the existence of. I've only briefly previewed through that version myself. It did not sound as terrible to me as many have made it out to be, really more missing the point of why the soundtrack stands the test of time than outright fumbling the execution, but it's also probably not essential to pick up at this point. For whatever reason, this official score album didn't see a proper release until 12 years after the movie first released, 2 years after the director's cut, and even this album is not a complete score of the movie. It omits a whole bunch of cues that appeared in the movie, and even includes a bunch of unused cues that never made it into the movie at all. For the movie's 25th anniversary in 2007, to coincide with the final cut version, there was an expanded 3-CD deluxe version of the album as well, but even this release wasn't like a full official score either. The second CD does in fact add a whole bunch more important cues that weren't in the original album, but the third CD is more all-new original materials created specifically for that 2007 version. If you wanted a comprehensive score that included every cue that appears in the film, you would have needed to resort to one of the 50 gazillion different bootlegs out there. Though if you ask me, I really can't complain about how the way the 94 version handled things. It may not be completely comprehensive, but it is clearly very well crafted to be listened to as a self-contained album that works just as well regardless of whether or not you've seen the movie. You should see the movie anyway because, I mean, it's a classic, and the album is obviously better if you've seen it, as is the case with all soundtracks. But if you don't want to bother, the album is still fantastic, completely removed from the movie's context. Hell, you'll still get some of said context, as a couple of tracks utilize samples of dialogue directly from the movie. Main Titles has dialogue from Deckard using special enhancement technology on a photo he found. Blush Response includes a big chunk of the initial scene where Rachael and Dr. Tyrell are first introduced. Wait For Me has some dialogue from Rachael while she's having her... Huh? Damn it. Millennium Park closed. This video seemed like such a good idea at the time, I swear. Wait For Me has some dialogue from Rachael while she's having her initial existential crisis upon starting to figure out she is a replicant. And of course, Tears and Rain includes the ever-famous monologue from Roy Batty at the very end of the movie. Some people have mentioned being bothered by the presence of these snippets and possibly feeling like they were taken out of the experience. Though, while I do feel like they don't absolutely need to be there, I don't agree that they're distracting in any capacity. I think they do well to help immerse the listener right back in the movie's universe. The only moment in this album that I maybe found to be distracting or take me out of the experience was the track One More Kiss, Dear, which is like an old 1940s or 50s style Bing Crosby-esque crooner cut performed by Don Percival with lyrics by 70s songwriter Peter Skellern. It's so stylistically far removed from the rest of the soundtrack to the point where I didn't even realize that this cut was also originally composed by Vangelis for the movie. I thought they'd licensed out some old, already existing R&B record from that era, and they were apparently planning to use the 1939 song by the Ink Spots, If I Didn't Care, but couldn't, I assume because of all the usual legal and budgetary shenanigans that come with licensing songs for movies. But yeah, I never would have guessed the track that they used instead was actually an original, because it certainly doesn't sound like anything else Vangelis ever composed in his life, at least that I know of. And while it certainly does fit the movie and feel impressively accurate to the era they were going for, it is a bit jarring to run into it on the album among all these futuristic ambient synth odysseys. If there's any cut on here that I'd be most likely to skip, it's that one. I typically just let it play out anyway though, since it is a good track in its own right. It's just that it's only good while the rest of this album is excellent. Right from the way this thing starts, with the main title theme and all of its synth washes building up to this really huge and dramatic feeling that perfectly captures the dystopian future city vibe that the movie is so well known for. And that's only the album's intro. It's not really that big a highlight in its own right. From there, we get a bunch of other tracks that link seamlessly together but each feel like their own well-realized tracks with their own separate feel to them. Blush Response is one of the darker and more percussion-heavy tracks with all these layers of very pretty cascading synth arpeggios being layered over all these clapping 80s drums. And said 80s drums don't feel as dated as they might have on maybe some of his other projects from this era like Direct. They perfectly blend into the overall vibe. And that track leads directly into the more delicate and romantic Wait For Me. Still got a plotting beat underscoring the whole thing, but mostly being carried by all these bright and soft electric piano melodies, with perhaps a bit of saxophone and vibraphone and harmonica around the edges for good measure. Absolutely beautiful. And that progression from darker to more delicate continues even further with Rachael's song. No beats on this one, just some warm ambient pads and plinking synths that resemble falling water droplets, all being brought together by the wordless vocal performance from Mary Hopkin. I don't even think that one's in the movie at all. Maybe it is and I missed it, but it still ended up as one of my personal favorite tracks in the bunch. Then, of course, there's the love theme. Now, on one hand, this track does underscore my least favorite scene in the movie, where Deckard is all but forcing Rachael to fall in love with him, and it's weird, and I'm not sure if it's aged all that well. But yeah, the music playing during that scene is good enough to make me forgive it. Driven by a fantastic saxophone performance from Dick Morrissey. What is that beeping? Or was that the bus? Driven by a fantastic saxophone performance from Dick Morrissey going over all these lush, romantic synth pads, and I just don't really have any words for it. I'm far too much of a sucker for blends of electronic and jazz like this, especially when the two genres are combined as seamlessly as they are throughout this album. So many back-to-back incredible mood pieces that so perfectly capture the setting, but all feel different enough from each other to never feel boring. One More Kiss Dear does kind of interrupt that near-flawless opening stretch as I went over already, but then we're led into Blade Runner Blues, the album's 9-minute centerpiece and its most iconic moment. This is the track that most exemplifies what Blade Runner is all about, and the track that will most readily come to mind when I think of the movie at all. And there's so little to it, like pretty much nothing but minimal synth solos on Vangelis' trademark CS80 the entire time with no real progression over time. But the specific synth tone he uses is... it's just a trademark to his own style and to this movie that like nobody can even try to copy it without it being really damn obvious, and God knows lots of people have tried. Just so effortlessly cool and perfectly fitting for being out in the city and just soaking up all the scenery around you and feeling that subtle melancholy vibe drifting through everything. And somehow that's not even my favorite cut in the bunch. It is the most iconic one, but my favorite one is the next cut, Memories of Green, which isn't even that synth-heavy aside from a few random electronic bleeps in the background. Really, it's just a solo piano piece, but it's so emotionally heavy in a way that I don't even know how to describe. It underscores the scene where Deckard presents the idea to Rachael that her memories may be fake and she starts breaking down in tears. And again, it's like no other track in the world could possibly fit this moment better. And what's weird is that this track wasn't even composed for Blade Runner at all. Originally, this track was made for his 1980 studio album, See You Later. And what's even more weird is that Memories of Green is itself kind of out of place on See You Later. Like, that album is really damn weird. It has so many jarring shifts in tone from jazzy soundtrack pieces to, like, these peppy, Kraftwerk-inspired synth-pop cuts, and manages to feel like a total clusterfuck despite only having 6 tracks. Like, in that context, this heart-wrenching solo piano piece is followed by a track that I can only describe as a shitpost. That album is still pretty good in spite of my issues, but my point is that Memories of Green's true home is on this soundtrack. It's where it was meant to belong the whole time, and Vangelis just didn't know it yet when he first composed it. And it works so much better when being surrounded by tracks that are, able to tonally support it. Now, from this point on, we do get a couple of different sounding tracks with not nearly as many jazz influences. We got Tales from the Future, which pops up multiple times in the movie, I think, in a lot of the most tense scenes, and features Vangelis' old bandmate from Aphrodite's Child, Demis Roussos, sorry for butcher pronunciation as per usual, delivering a very strange, high-pitched vocal performance that I did not realize was coming from a guy the first, 5 times I heard it. I think it's trying to have some kind of, Middle Eastern flavor. This track was my least favorite on a few listens leading up to my making this video, though that did change when I rewatched the movie and saw all the disorienting scenes where this fit as well as it did. And this track is complemented quite well by the also very Middle Eastern flavored Damask Rose, a duet between a mysterious violin and someone humming that is simultaneously chill and intense. The track is pretty short and kind of blends into the previous one, but it's still a highlight. And then that leads to the end titles, which obviously plays over the movie's credits. A much more percussive and intense and cyberpunky track than the majority of the album. Those synth bass lines that come in at first and run through much of the track have a bit of a Kraftwerk-ish feel to them, but the dramatic synth pads and rumbling timpanis are a lot more easily recognized as Vangelis. Really carries that symphonic feeling that you would explore on other albums from this era like Mask. It almost catches you off guard when it comes up, since the rest of the soundtrack has been so ambient-centric so far, and all about creating its vibes. This one is a lot more bombastic than anything else here, in a good way. But that leaves the actual album closer in Tears in Rain, which is fittingly as sentimental and warm and melancholy to fit with the tone of the entire project and the scene it underscores in the movie. And, that's everything on the 1994 Blade Runner soundtrack album. I haven't heard everything on the deluxe edition as of recording this. It does have the cues for Dr. Tyrell's death and Deckard and Roy's duel, so obviously there's going to be plenty of good stuff there. I heard a lot of mixed reviews of the third CD of original material that came with that version. I'll leave some text on screen to let you know if there's anything worth the trouble on there. But concerning the main soundtrack album from '94, it's already considered one of the best movie soundtracks of all time and one of the best ambient albums of all time, and I'm certainly not about to disagree. It really is just as much of an absolute masterwork as its reputation implies, and despite how many have tried to copy it over the years, it hasn't lost any of its initial freshness. Right from when I first saw the movie in college to when I picked up the album years later, and every time I've sat with it since, I'm consistently floored by how unparalleled it is when it comes to crafting that perfect mood and atmosphere. And sure, maybe some parts can feel a tad disjointed, mainly just the one track that feels kind of out of place. And one could complain about how the album doesn't completely follow what made it into the movie one-to-one, though I think the way it was presented as is probably made for a stronger album experience, one that is instead better suited to just transporting you into the world of the movie. And for a movie best known for its world building, I don't know how you could be unsatisfied with that. Not much else to say besides R.I.P. Vangelis. Thank you for all your decades of service helping to pioneer the world of electronic music and open up even more eyes to it, for your widely varied studio albums, your iconic soundtrack work, and for this classic album in particular. I'm overall feeling a solid 9 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave your comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.